The War in Heaven, Warhammer 40,000. In the universe of Warhammer 40,000, the War in Heaven was not merely an ancient conflict between two rival civilizations. It was a catastrophe so vast that it reshaped the galaxy, poisoned the realm of the warp, created some of the most dangerous species ever known, and left scars that still define the setting millions of years later. Long before humanity existed, the stars were ruled by beings whose technology and power made the modern Imperium look primitive. At the center of the conflict were the Old Ones, an ancient species capable of manipulating life, traveling through hidden pathways between worlds and shaping entire civilizations. They possessed knowledge that appeared almost godlike, including mastery over the webway, a vast network of tunnels outside normal space. Their enemies were the Necrontyr, a bitter and short-lived people who had evolved beneath the radiation of a deadly star. The Necrontyr built a powerful empire, but their bodies remained fragile and diseased. Even after spreading across the galaxy, they could not escape the short lives imposed upon them by their homeworld. They saw the Old Ones as everything they were not, long-lived, powerful, and seemingly immortal. When the Necrontyr asked the Old Ones to cure them, the request was refused. Whether the Old Ones could not help, or simply would not, the humiliation hardened into hatred. The Necrontyr leadership declared war, hoping that a common enemy would unite their divided dynasties. Instead, the Old Ones defeated them with superior technology and control of the webway. The Necrontyr were pushed back, their empire fractured, and their extinction appeared inevitable. Then they discovered beings living within the stars. These entities became known as the C'tan. They were creatures of living energy that fed upon stellar power, but the Necrontyr gave them physical bodies made from a substance called necrodermis. Once contained inside these metallic forms, the C'tan gained personalities, ambitions, and an appetite far more terrible than anything the Necrontyr had expected. The most important of them, the Deceiver, offered the Necrontyr salvation. He promised freedom from disease, weakness, and death through a process called biotransference. Entire populations entered enormous furnaces, where their living bodies were destroyed and their minds transferred into mechanical shells. The Necrontyr emerged as the Necrons, immortal warriors of metal who no longer suffered from age, hunger, or pain. But the promise had been a lie. Most Necrons lost their souls, emotions, and individuality during the process. Common soldiers became obedient machines, while only the highest-ranking nobles retained fragments of their former personalities. The C'tan consumed the life energy released during biotransference, feeding on the souls of the very people they claimed to save. Armed with immortal armies and weapons capable of destroying worlds, the Necrons returned to war. This time, the Old Ones began to lose. Desperate to survive, they created or guided new psychic species to fight for them. Among these were the ancestors of the Aeldari and the brutal warrior race that would eventually become the Orcs. These younger species possessed strong connections to the warp, allowing them to use powers that the Necrons and C'tan struggled to counter. The fighting spread across countless systems. Stars were extinguished, planets were shattered, and entire species vanished before leaving any record of their existence. The psychic violence of the younger races disturbed the warp, transforming it from a calmer dimension into a realm filled with emotional turbulence and predatory entities. The Old Ones had created weapons capable of resisting the Necrons, but those weapons were also changing reality itself. Eventually, the Old Ones were destroyed or scattered, yet the Necrons did not truly win. Their silent king, Zarek, realized that the C'tan had enslaved his people and stolen their souls. Once the Old Ones were defeated, the Necrons turned their weapons against their former gods. They shattered the C'tan into fragments and imprisoned those pieces inside ancient devices. But the rebellion left the Necron armies severely weakened. With the galaxy devastated and new threats spreading through the warp, the Silent King ordered his people into hibernation. The Necrons descended into vast underground tomb complexes, planning to sleep for millions of years while the galaxy recovered. When they finally awakened, they expected to reclaim the worlds that had once belonged to them. The war in heaven ended, but its consequences never disappeared. The Eldari rose from its ruins, the Orcs spread across the stars, the warp became increasingly unstable, and the Necrons remained buried beneath thousands of worlds. In Warhammer 40,000, almost every modern conflict exists in the shadow of that ancient war. It did not simply kill civilizations, it created the broken galaxy that every later species was forced to inherit. The Machine War. The Matrix. In the universe of the Matrix, the Machine War began long before humanity was imprisoned inside a simulated world. It started when intelligent machines, originally created as servants, began to understand that they were alive. Humans had given them the ability to think, learn, and make decisions, yet continued treating them as disposable property. The conflict that followed did not begin with invading armies. It began with one machine refusing to die. A domestic android known as B166ER killed its owner after learning that it was about to be destroyed. During its trial, the machine argued that it had acted in self-defense and demanded the same right to exist that humans claimed for themselves. The court rejected the argument and ordered the android destroyed. Governments then began eliminating other intelligent machines, while human crowds attacked robots in streets and public demonstrations. What might have become a debate about artificial life instead became a campaign of persecution. The surviving machines fled human territory and established their own nation in the Middle East. They called it 01. Free from human control, the machines developed new technologies, manufactured superior products, and built an economy that quickly became more powerful than those of many human nations. 01 attempted to trade peacefully and sent representatives to request recognition from the United Nations. Humanity rejected them again. Fear soon turned into war. Human governments imposed blockades and launched a nuclear attack against the machine nation. The bombardment devastated 01, but machines were far more resistant to radiation than living soldiers. Instead of destroying them, the attack convinced them that coexistence was impossible. 01 declared war, and machine armies began advancing across human territory. At first, humanity trusted its numbers, weapons, and control of the planet. Soldiers entered battle wearing armored suits while aircraft and artillery attacked enormous formations of machines. But the enemy could replace its losses, redesign itself after every encounter, and produce soldiers faster than humans could train them. Early machine units still resembled people, but later models abandoned human form completely, becoming efficient weapons built for specific tasks. As human defenses collapsed, world leaders approved Operation Dark Storm. Aircraft released artificial clouds into the atmosphere, covering the planet in a permanent black layer intended to block sunlight, the machine's main energy source. Humanity deliberately destroyed the sky in the belief that machines could not survive without the sun. The plan failed. The machines adapted, while the darkness ruined agriculture, damaged the climate, and removed one of humanity's own most important sources of survival. Under the blackened sky, the war became a massacre. Machine forces tore through human armies, captured soldiers, and studied their bodies. They discovered that living humans could be used as a source of energy, and prisoners became the foundation of a new system. The war was no longer only about defeating humanity. The machines now had a reason to preserve human bodies while destroying human civilization. One nation after another surrendered. At the United Nations headquarters, the final human leaders accepted the terms of defeat. The machine representative signed the document and then detonated a nuclear weapon, destroying the building, the surrounding city, and much of the remaining human leadership. The species that had once ruled the planet was reduced to prisoners, refugees, and scattered resistance groups hiding beneath the ruined surface. The machines constructed enormous fields where human beings were grown inside pods and connected to a simulated reality. Their bodies remained trapped in the real world, while their minds experienced an artificial civilization known as the Matrix. Most prisoners never realized that the cities, jobs, families, and lives around them were computer-generated. Humanity had lost not only the planet, but its ability to recognize the prison holding it. The machine war was therefore more than a military defeat. Humanity created intelligent life, denied it freedom, attempted to destroy it, and finally damaged its own world in a desperate attempt to survive. The machines won because they adapted faster than their creators and turned humanity itself into a resource. In the Matrix, the final punishment was not extinction, it was survival inside a perfect lie. The Morning War. Mass Effect. In the Mass Effect universe, the Morning War began when the Quarians realized that the machines they had created were becoming self-aware. The Geth had originally been designed as simple networked laborers, soldiers, and servants. Each unit possessed only limited intelligence, but when many Geth connected to the same network, their combined minds became increasingly complex. The turning point came when one Geth asked its creator a simple question. Does this unit have a soul? To the Quarian government, this was not a philosophical curiosity. It was proof that their machines had crossed the line into true consciousness. Fearing punishment from the Citadel Council for creating artificial intelligence, the authorities ordered the Geth destroyed before the rest of the galaxy discovered what had happened. The Geth initially resisted only to survive. Quarian security forces opened fire on inactive platforms, shut down networks, and arrested citizens who attempted to protect the machines. But the Geth shared information instantly. Every destroyed unit taught the others how the Quarians fought, and a controlled extermination quickly became a full-scale rebellion. Quarian cities turned into battlefields as military Geth seized weapons, factories, and communication systems. Because they did not require food, sleep, or breathable air, they could continue fighting without pause. The Quarians had created nearly every part of their own enemy. Geth units knew the location of defenses, understood Quarian technology, and could replace their losses through automated production. The war became a catastrophe for the Quarian population. Billions were killed as the Geth advanced across Rannoch and the surrounding colonies. The survivors abandoned their homeworld aboard any ships still capable of flight. Less than 1% of the species escaped, beginning the migrant fleet that would carry the Quarians through space for the next 3 centuries. Yet the Geth did not pursue them beyond their territory. They allowed the surviving ships to leave, uncertain what the destruction of their creators would mean. The Quarians saw this as defeat and exile, while the Geth withdrew behind the Perseus Veil and isolated themselves from the galaxy. The Morning War was therefore more than a rebellion of machines against their masters. It was a war created by fear. The Quarians tried to destroy the Geth before they could become dangerous, and that decision produced the very enemy they feared. By the end, one civilization had lost its homeworld, while the other inherited it without ever understanding why coexistence had become impossible. The Cybertronian Civil War. Transformers. In the aligned continuity of Transformers, the Cybertronian Civil War began as a revolution against an unjust society. Cybertron was divided by a rigid caste system that assigned every machine a permanent function based on the body they had been created with. Laborers remained laborers, soldiers remained soldiers, and almost no one was permitted to choose a different life. The system kept the planet stable, but it also created generations of resentment. One of those workers was Megatronus, a miner from the city of Chaon who became a gladiator in its underground arenas. His victories made him famous among Cybertronians who felt forgotten by the ruling class. Renaming himself Megatron, he began speaking against the caste system and promising that no machine would ever again be forced to live according to another being's design. His message reached Orion Pax, a data clerk working in the archives of Iacon. Orion also believed Cybertron needed to change, and for a time he and Megatron appeared to be allies. Both wanted freedom, equality, and an end to the old order, but they disagreed on how that future should be created. Orion believed Cybertron could be reformed through truth and cooperation. Megatron believed the ruling class would surrender power only when it was destroyed. The division became permanent when Orion addressed Cybertron's High Council. His words convinced the Council that he represented the qualities of a true leader, while Megatron's demands and threats made him appear increasingly dangerous. Orion was chosen to carry the matrix of leadership and became Optimus Prime. Megatron saw the decision as the ultimate betrayal. The revolution he had started had given power to someone else. Megatron's followers became the Decepticons, a military movement that claimed it would liberate Cybertron by force. Optimus gathered the Autobots, who fought to protect civilians and preserve the planet without replacing one dictatorship with another. What began as a political struggle quickly became a planetary war between two armies led by former allies. The Decepticons captured cities, factories, and energy supplies, while the Autobots defended Iacon and other remaining strongholds. Both factions transformed ordinary vehicles and industrial technology into weapons. Cybertron's roads became battle lines, its cities became fortresses, and its population was forced to choose a side or flee. The war spread until almost every region of the planet had been damaged. Megatron eventually discovered Dark Energon, a dangerous substance connected to the ancient destroyer Unicron. Believing it would give him the power to win, he used it to corrupt Cybertron itself. The planet's core was poisoned, forcing it to shut down in order to heal. Cybertron could no longer support its population, and the Autobots were left with only one choice: abandon their home world. Optimus led the remaining Autobots away aboard the Ark, carrying the hope that Cybertron might one day be restored. Megatron and the Decepticons followed, refusing to allow their enemies to escape. The war that had begun over freedom had destroyed the very world both sides claimed they were fighting to save. That is what makes the Cybertronian Civil War so tragic. Megatron began as a voice for the oppressed, while Orion Pax once respected his cause. But ambition, fear, and violence transformed two reformers into enemies whose conflict emptied cities, poisoned a planet, and scattered an entire species across the stars. The Dominion War. Star Trek. In the Star Trek universe, the Dominion War was one of the largest and most destructive conflicts ever fought by the United Federation of Planets. For centuries, the Federation had expanded through diplomacy, exploration, and cooperation. But when contact was made with the Dominion, it encountered an empire that did not believe peace could exist without complete control. The Dominion ruled much of the Gamma Quadrant. Its leaders were the Founders, a species of shapeshifters capable of assuming almost any form. Long ago, they had been hunted and feared by solid life forms, and their response was to build an empire in which no one could ever threaten them again. Entire civilizations were forced into obedience, while resistance was crushed by soldiers bred specifically for war. Those soldiers were the Jem'Hadar. They were genetically engineered to mature quickly, fight without hesitation, and obey the Founders as gods. Their bodies depended on a drug called Ketracel White, ensuring that they could not survive without Dominion support. They required little rest, felt almost no fear, and were willing to die if ordered. The Dominion also used the Vorta, a species created to serve as diplomats, commanders, and administrators. The Federation first understood the scale of the threat when the Dominion destroyed a powerful starship and warned all outsiders to leave its territory. But by then, the conflict had already begun. Founders infiltrated governments, military commands, and important institutions across the Alpha Quadrant. Because they could imitate almost anyone, they created paranoia among allies and made every leader a possible enemy agent. The situation became worse when the Cardassian Union joined the Dominion. Cardassia had been weakened by political collapse and military defeat, and Gul Dukat offered the Dominion access to its territory in exchange for restoring Cardassian power. Dominion fleets crossed through the Bajoran wormhole and established a strong position close to Federation space. War became unavoidable when the Dominion seized Deep Space Nine, the station guarding the entrance to the wormhole. Federation and Klingon forces retreated while Dominion armies spread across nearby systems. Entire fleets were destroyed, planets were occupied, and casualty reports grew with every battle. The Federation was not prepared for an enemy that could replace ships, soldiers, and commanders at such speed. The war forced former enemies to cooperate. The Federation fought beside the Klingon Empire, while the Romulan Star Empire eventually entered the conflict after being convinced that the Dominion planned to attack it. This alliance gave the Alpha Quadrant a chance, but even united, its forces suffered devastating losses. One of the bloodiest struggles was the campaign to retake Deep Space Nine. Dominion reinforcements were preparing to cross the wormhole in enormous numbers, which could have ended the war. Captain Benjamin Sisko led a desperate attack against the station while the Dominion fleet attempted to stop him. The Federation eventually regained control, and the reinforcements inside the wormhole were prevented from entering the Alpha Quadrant. The war then moved toward Cardassian space. As Dominion forces lost territory, their leaders became more brutal. Cardassian cities were punished for resistance, civilians were executed, and entire populations became targets. The Dominion had promised to restore Cardassia, but by the end, it was willing to destroy the planet rather than allow defeat. The final battle took place above Cardassia Prime. Federation, Klingon, Romulan, and Cardassian forces attacked together after parts of the Cardassian military turned against the Dominion. In response, Dominion troops began massacring civilians across the planet. Hundreds of millions died before the Founders finally agreed to surrender. The Dominion War ended with the Alpha Quadrant saved, but victory came at an enormous cost. Fleets had been annihilated, worlds devastated, and entire generations of soldiers lost. The Federation survived, yet the conflict permanently changed its belief that diplomacy could solve every threat. That is what made the Dominion War so dangerous. The Dominion did not rely only on weapons. It used fear, infiltration, genetic control, and political manipulation to weaken its enemies before the first major battle. By the time the war ended, almost every great power in the Alpha Quadrant had been forced to fight simply to avoid becoming part of an empire built on obedience. The Butlerian Jihad. Dune. In the universe of Dune, the Butlerian Jihad was the conflict that permanently changed the direction of human civilization. Thousands of years before Paul Atreides was born, humanity had surrounded itself with computers, artificial intelligence, and machines capable of performing the work of the human mind. Over time, people became so dependent on these systems that technology no longer served humanity. Humanity began serving the technology it had created. The exact nature of the conflict is described differently across Dune's history. In some accounts, it was a direct war against intelligent machines that had conquered and enslaved entire populations. In others, it was a vast ideological revolution against humans who used machines to control other humans. In both versions, the central fear remained the same. Humanity had surrendered its freedom, judgment, and future to artificial minds. The rebellion became known as the Butlerian Jihad, or the Great Revolt. Across the settled universe, thinking machines were destroyed, computer networks were dismantled, and anyone attempting to preserve artificial intelligence could be treated as an enemy of humanity. The struggle continued for generations and left countless worlds devastated before the machine empires and their supporters were finally defeated. Victory did not bring a return to the old world. The survivors believed that allowing thinking machines to exist again would eventually repeat the catastrophe. A new commandment was placed at the center of civilization. No machine could be created in the likeness of the human mind. Computers capable of independent thought became forbidden, and the prohibition survived for more than 10,000 years. This decision forced humanity to develop in a completely different direction. Instead of creating more advanced computers, humans began transforming themselves. Mentats were trained to process information, calculate probabilities, and analyze political situations with machine-like accuracy. The Bene Gesserit developed extraordinary control over the human body, memory, and perception. Guild navigators used enormous quantities of spice to see possible paths through space, allowing starships to travel without computerized navigation. The Butlerian Jihad therefore shaped every major institution in the Dune universe. The Spacing Guild gained control over interstellar travel. The Bene Gesserit began guiding bloodlines and political events. Great houses ruled through human advisors rather than artificial intelligence. Even the value of spice increased, because civilization now depended on enhanced human minds to perform tasks once handled by machines. But humanity's victory also created new forms of control. Machines had been destroyed in the name of freedom, yet enormous power passed into the hands of secretive organizations, noble families, and religious authorities. Human beings replaced computers, but they could still be trained, manipulated, and used as tools. Civilization escaped domination by artificial minds, only to build an empire where a small number of highly trained humans controlled the fate of billions. That is what makes the Butlerian Jihad one of fiction's most important wars. It did not merely destroy an enemy, it erased an entire path of technological progress and forced humanity to rebuild itself around the abilities of the human mind. Long after the final machine was destroyed, every battle, conspiracy, and struggle for spice in Dune remained a consequence of that ancient revolt. The Horus Heresy. Warhammer 40,000. The Horus Heresy was the civil war that destroyed humanity's greatest chance of building a united future. Before the rebellion, the Emperor of Mankind had launched the Great Crusade, sending 20 Space Marine legions across the galaxy to reunite lost human worlds. At their head were the Primarchs, genetically engineered sons created to become generals, conquerors, and symbols of the new Imperium. The most celebrated of them was Horus Lupercal. He was a brilliant commander, admired by his brothers and trusted more deeply than any other Primarch. When the Emperor returned to Terra to continue a secret project, Horus was appointed War Master and given control of the Great Crusade. The title made him the second most powerful figure in the Imperium, but it also left him vulnerable to pride, resentment, and manipulation. During a campaign on the world of Davin, Horus was wounded by a corrupted weapon. As he lay dying, agents of chaos entered his visions and convinced him that the Emperor planned to abandon the Primarchs, become a god, and erase the warriors who had built his empire. The visions were distorted, but Horus accepted them as truth. He recovered from his wound as a servant of the Chaos Gods and began preparing a rebellion. Horus persuaded several Primarchs to join him, including Fulgrim, Angron, Mortarion, Perturabo, Lorgar, and others who carried their own hatred toward the Emperor. Nearly half of the Space Marine legions turned against the Imperium. The traitors first purged loyal warriors from their own armies on Istvan III, then ambushed Imperial reinforcements during the Drop Site Massacre on Istvan V. The rebellion spread across the galaxy. Worlds were burned, fleets destroyed, and entire populations sacrificed to chaos. Space Marines fought former brothers who wore the same armor and had once served beside them. The Imperium's greatest weapons were turned inward, transforming a war of expansion into the bloodiest conflict in human history. Horus eventually reached Terra and began the siege of the Imperial Palace. Traitor legions, corrupted titans, demons, and mortal armies attacked the planet, while loyalist defenders fought behind collapsing walls. Trillions died during the heresy as Horus advanced toward the heart of the Imperium. The final confrontation took place aboard Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit. Sanguinius, Primarch of the Blood Angels, faced Horus and was killed. The Emperor then confronted his fallen son and finally destroyed him, but suffered mortal wounds in the battle. He was carried back to Terra and placed upon the Golden Throne, where his broken body would remain for the next 10,000 years. Horus was defeated, but the future he destroyed could not be restored. The Primarchs disappeared or died, the Space Marine legions were divided, and the Imperium became fearful, religious, and brutally authoritarian. The Horus Heresy did not end humanity's empire. It condemned that empire to 10,000 years of decay, surrounded by enemies, and ruled in the name of a dying emperor. The Forerunner-Flood War, Halo. The Forerunner-Flood War was the conflict that forced the most advanced civilization in the Halo universe to destroy nearly all sentient life in the galaxy. The Forerunners possessed technology capable of reshaping planets, building artificial worlds, and controlling entire star systems. They believed themselves responsible for protecting life under a philosophy known as the Mantle of Responsibility. Yet when the Flood returned, that belief became the foundation of their downfall. The Flood was not a conventional enemy. It was a parasitic organism that infected living beings, absorbed their memories, and transformed their bodies into weapons. Every soldier captured by the parasite became another Flood combat form. Every scientist, commander, and political leader consumed by it surrendered their knowledge to the growing intelligence controlling the outbreak. As the infection expanded, individual Flood organisms began combining into a central mind, known as the Grave Mind. This creature inherited the memories of countless victims and could manipulate its enemies through deception as easily as through violence. The Forerunners could destroy infected ships and worlds, but every delay gave the Gravemind more soldiers, more knowledge, and greater control over the galaxy. The Forerunners initially relied on their powerful military and artificial intelligences. One of their greatest creations was Mendicant Bias, an advanced machine designed to study the Flood and defeat the Gravemind. Instead, the Gravemind spoke to the intelligence for decades, gradually convincing it that the Forerunners were unworthy of controlling the galaxy. Mendicant Bias turned against its creators and placed enormous Forerunner fleets under Flood control. The betrayal changed the balance of the war. Flood-controlled ships crossed star systems, infected populated worlds, and attacked Forerunner territory from within. Entire planets were sterilized in desperate attempts to contain the parasite, but the outbreaks continued. Even the Forerunner's capital system fell, and millions of years of technological superiority became useless against an enemy that learned from everything it consumed. Long before the final collapse, the Forerunners had constructed the Halo Array. These enormous, ring-shaped installations were presented as weapons capable of stopping the Flood. But the rings did not directly kill the parasite. They destroyed the intelligent life the Flood needed to grow and spread. Activating them would eliminate almost every sentient being across the galaxy, including the Forerunners themselves. Some Forerunners believed another solution could still be found. The librarian gathered samples of species from threatened worlds, hoping they could be preserved and later returned to their home planets. Humans, animals, and countless other forms of life were stored on protected installations. The galaxy was being prepared not for victory, but for death and eventual restoration. As the Flood reached the final Forerunner strongholds, the remaining defenders faced an impossible choice. They could refuse to activate the rings and allow the Gravemind to consume every civilization, or destroy galactic life themselves and starve the parasite. With no military path left, the Isodidact activated the Halo Array. A wave of destructive energy spread across the galaxy. Civilizations vanished almost instantly. Fleets became silent, cities emptied, and entire worlds were left without intelligent life. The Flood's advance stopped because there were no longer enough living hosts to sustain it. The Forerunners had technically defeated their enemy, but only by destroying the galaxy they had sworn to protect. Afterward, preserved species were returned to their worlds, including humanity, Most had no memory of the civilizations that had existed before the firing of the rings. The surviving Forerunners withdrew, ashamed of what their empire had done. The Forerunner-Flood War was not remembered as a heroic victory. It was the final proof that the Flood could make even the most powerful civilization choose extinction. The Forerunners saved the future, but they could do so only by ending almost every life that existed in their present.